What if I told you that the impact of colonization in Africa is still being felt today, in ways that you might not even realize? Colonization had a profound impact on Africa, both positive and negative. On the one hand, it introduced new technologies and infrastructure to the continent. On the other hand, it also led to the exploitation of African resources and the destruction of African cultures. The effects of colonization are still being felt today in a number of ways. For example, many African countries are still grappling with the legacy of artificial borders that were drawn by European powers without regard for ethnic or cultural groups. This has led to conflict and instability in some cases. Additionally, the exploitation of African resources during colonization has left many African countries with underdeveloped economies and environmental problems. Let's look at the complex history of colonialism in Africa. European powers exercised direct control and administration over territories in Africa. This period, which spanned from the 1800s to the mid-20th century, was marked by significant changes in both Europe and Africa. Conquest was central to colonialism. European colonialists attacked African states not only politically and economically, but also culturally and socially to assert their dominance. This colonization led to the enslavement of African populations, and it's crucial to understand the impact it had on the continent. During this era, European powers were motivated by various factors. The Industrial Revolution in Europe ushered in rapid socio-economic changes, causing an increase in production. However, agricultural progress lagged behind, making it challenging to satisfy the growing demand for raw materials required by industries. This situation forced European nations, such as Britain, to seek additional raw materials beyond their borders, and Africa, with its vast population, became an attractive source. Moreover, Europe faced a dilemma: how to feed the burgeoning urban population. Traditional agricultural methods in rural areas couldn't produce enough food for urban centers. So the need for a market for both raw materials and food arose. Africa, with its large population, became a ready market for European products. As technology advanced, European industries produced goods faster than they could be consumed locally. This overproduction led to the desire for external markets, and Africa presented a solution. However, to make African economies compatible with international trade, they needed to be monetized and linked with the global market. Hence, direct control of African economies and political administration became necessary. The colonialists were also keen to protect the capital they had invested in Africa. Initially, African technology was inadequate for the exploitation of these capitals, making it essential for the colonialists to reorient the African labor force to suit their needs. To ensure this, they resorted to compulsion, using government machinery and the imposition of laws to compel Africans to work in the new industries. If you are having fun and being informative, please like and share the video. Moving to colonization again. European powers systematically interfered with the sovereignty of African states, sometimes favoring one group over another. Gunboat diplomacy, consular intervention, and merchant intrigue became commonplace, undermining the power and sovereignty of African states. British traders penetrated the African coast in powerful gunboats. Over time, they began to lose their initial fear and respect for local authorities. With intrigue and determination, they gradually displaced African traders from their role in the Euro-African trade. It then imposed unequal trade agreements on African states, forcing them to open their Western markets to British involvement. When African rulers resisted such demands, this often led to trade wars and, in some unfortunate cases, outright gun battles. Emerged as the most effective strategy for European colonizers to establish and maintain their dominance. Colonizers began to seize land and organize labor to exploit the vast resources of the continent. African people were not used to this new economic system. Africans were forced to work on colonial plantations and industries. Africans had to work because their traditional way of life was disrupted. It wasn't a willing choice. It was a matter of survival. In some regions, heavy taxes were levied, and their collection was strictly enforced. Africans had to sell their labor to whites to earn money for this tax. In cases where taxation alone did not provide sufficient labor, compulsory labor ordinances were enacted. South Africa, in particular, has witnessed innovative approaches to meet its mining needs. They sought economic bargaining separate from Africans, a concept alien to their traditional ways. Africans had no choice but to labor in the mines under such conditions. Another effective strategy was taxation in the form introduced by the colonialists. It was unfamiliar to most African communities, and the colonial authorities insisted that taxes be paid in colonial currency. Tax evasion came with a severe penalty, and Africans feared the consequences. Through these strategies, colonialists succeeded in maintaining their direct control over African territories, using the continent's labor and resources for their own profit and development. As you know, the effects of colonialism in Africa were not all positive. One of the things the colonial powers did was introduce Western education. Now, on the surface, that might sound like a good thing, right? But here's the catch. This education wasn't rooted in African culture. It was more about reading and writing, and it didn't really encourage technological development or industrialization. Before colonialism, Africans had their own unique technological skills. They were skilled in sculpting, carving, weaving, and more. They were self-sufficient in many ways. However, colonial education pushed them away from their indigenous skills towards something that didn't really help them progress technologically. So, in a way, it set Africa back in terms of technological development. Now, let's talk about the economy. Colonialism messed up the economic landscape in several ways. Africans were often pushed into producing raw materials for the colonial powers, rather than encouraged to develop their own industries. The prices for African raw materials were kept low, while the manufactured goods imported from the colonial powers were expensive. This basically made Africans work hard to afford foreign goods, while the colonialists raked in the profits. The way commerce was structured was also problematic. African trade became mainly export-import oriented, and it was integrated into the global market prematurely. This meant that African economies couldn't fully develop their internal strengths before being exposed to international competition. It's like trying to run before you can walk. The absence of reinvestment in African economies is another issue. When profits were made, they often didn't get reinvested in Africa. Instead, they were sent back to the colonial powers. This lack of reinvestment hindered economic growth and development. Transportation was another area where colonialism fell short. The transport networks were primarily designed to move raw materials to the coast for export rather than connecting different regions within Africa. So, while it facilitated the extraction of resources, it didn't do much to enhance internal development and communication. And when it comes to social amenities and urbanization, they are often concentrated in specific areas, neglecting many other parts of Africa. This lopsided development created inequalities and disparities within the continent. The African territories they conquered weren't all the same. They had different roles. Some were treasure troves of minerals, like Congo and South Africa, while others were designated for plantation crops. Then, there were those earmarked for European settlers and those for peasant production. Each category had its own colonial policies and objectives. Take Nigeria and Ghana, for instance. They fell into the peasant production category. But what was life like under colonial rule? Well, it varied depending on the colonial power. The British preferred indirect rule, ruling through traditional institutions with British supervision. Meanwhile, the French had a different approach. They aimed for assimilation, trying to integrate their colonies fully into France. When that didn't work out so well, they resorted to associations with some groups. Colonialism left deep scars. It created a divide between the center and periphery nations, where the periphery produced raw materials only to see them snatched away by the center. Africa was caught in this web of exploitation. The colonialists disrupted the African economy, education, trade, and even currency systems. They pushed a monocultural economy, stifling industrialization. The labor force suffered, toiling on colonial plantations for meager wages, while African traders saw their businesses taken over. But that's not all. Colonialism intensified class struggle, tribalism, and ethnic tensions, strategies used by the colonial powers to maintain control. Divide and rule was the British policy in Nigeria, sowing discord to prolong their rule. Today, the legacy of colonialism looms large. Many African nations still grapple with the consequences: economic dependency, class divisions, tribal conflicts, and more. The past casts a long shadow on the present. In a nutshell, colonialism in Africa was a complex and devastating chapter in history. It shaped the continent in ways that continue to reverberate today, and understanding its impact helps us appreciate the challenges and complexities of the African experience. So, what do you think is the biggest impact of colonization on Africa?